Okay, I want to welcome all our guests today. I'm going to begin by introducing myself. I am Howard Slatkin. I'm the executive director of CHPC, and I'd like to welcome everyone to our CHPC book club discussion on Homelessness is a Housing Problem by Gregg Colburn and Clayton Alder. Before I get to introduce our panelists for today, I'd like to offer just a few words about CHPC. CHPC is a nonprofit research and education organization founded in 1937. We're dedicated to driving public policy that supports the city's housing stock and meets the needs of New Yorkers and our neighborhoods. We do this through a mix of independent research, importing lessons and best practices from around the globe, and by convening conversations that frame important issues and guide public discussion toward practical solutions. Our work at CHPC is committed to both the big picture, setting clear goals and direction for the issues that need to be addressed and making sure that public policy keeps its eye on the ball, and to sweating the details to make sure that it all works. CHPC hosts events, both live and virtual, to highlight aspects of our work. And our biggest event of the year is coming up on March 29th, our 63rd annual luncheon, at which we honor people and projects that have made exceptional contributions to housing and planning in New York City. On the topic of today's discussion, this year we're excited to have among our honorees Molly Park, First Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Homeless Services, for her leadership and advocacy for the housing needs of the city's most vulnerable, as well as Jerusalem Demsis, whose national housing beat for The Atlantic has illuminated, among other issues, the link between housing supply and homelessness. We'll be dropping a link in the chat where you can find information about our upcoming event and all our honorees. Today's book talk is actually my first public event since taking on the leadership of CHPC. I've come here after over 20 years at the New York City Department of City Planning, where a major focus of my work was how the city can meet the challenges of growth and housing affordability. I can't imagine a more perfect note for me to start on than with this event, because Homelessness is a Housing Problem is the kind of book that resonates top to bottom with CHPC's mission. It is a piece of meticulous, data-driven research directed at repairing our basic understanding of homelessness in America. The book aims to put to rest myths and misunderstandings about homelessness that not only distort public policy, but also undermine the political motivation to properly take on the issue of homelessness. The underlying goal here is to guide the discussion toward better public policy. So we're thrilled to bring together for this book club discussion a panel of speakers with incredible knowledge and insight on this subject, including co-author of Homelessness is a Housing Problem, Gregg Colburn. Gregg is an assistant professor of real estate in the University of Washington's College of Built Environments. He has a PhD in public affairs from the University of Minnesota, and his research focuses on housing policy, housing markets, housing affordability, and homelessness. We also have with us Jessica Katz, the Chief Housing Officer of the City of New York. Jessica oversees the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, the New York City Housing Authority, Housing Development Corporation, and other city housing offices. She was previously executive director of CHPC, and before that served for over 10 years at the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development, overseeing the creation of affordable and special needs housing. And Rob Robinson is special advisor at Partners for Dignity and Rights and a professor of urbanism for the Design and Ecology program at the New School. In 2001, after losing his job, Rob spent 2 years homeless on the streets of Miami and 10 months in a New York City shelter before overcoming homelessness. He has been active in the housing movement, both in New York City and internationally, since 2007. We're really, really excited to have all three of them here with us together. Our format for today will begin with a presentation from Gregg on the book, after which I will moderate a Q&A session with our panelists. And for the latter portion of our Q&A, we will ask questions submitted by the audience, so please submit any questions you have in the Q&A box at any time during the presentation. And now, over to you, Gregg. Please take it away.
Thank you, Howard. I really appreciate the invite. Good morning to everyone in New York, from sunny Seattle, which is a rare thing on a February morning here. So I'm happy to be with you. I'm going to do a quick 15-minute overview of our book, and then I look forward to sharing the panel with Jessica and Rob. I'm going to share my slides here. This worked perfectly a moment ago. 1 second. And we're off. Are you seeing that okay? Okay. Thank you again for the invite. So my co-author and I got together in 2018, 2019 to talk about writing this book. This is the book. University of California Press was our publisher. The motivation for writing this book was really an observation that I had since I'd moved to Seattle, which for those of you who haven't been out here, we have a terrible homelessness problem. You know, Seattle, San Francisco, LA, New York, Boston, DC, really the big 6 cities for homelessness in the United States. I would go to these community meetings and meetings with elected leaders and advocates, and I didn't really feel like our community understood what was driving this crisis. And as a result, I felt like our policy response was a little scattershot. And all these competing narratives were in play in the press and in conversations that that probably distracted, I think, our attention from what I believe to be the root cause of this crisis, which is the lack of access to housing. The academic literature was fairly clear about this relationship between access to housing and homelessness, but I didn't feel like that had really made it out into the general public. And so the purpose of this book was not to necessarily break new ground, but it was really to frame our understanding of homelessness from what we've known in the academic literature for a general audience of readers who are concerned about what is going on in US cities. And so that was really the driver here of our book. So each January, our cities, all cities in the United States conduct a survey and a census of the population of people experiencing homelessness. And so we just completed this at the end of January here in 2023. This is based on 2019 data, but at the same time, we ask people questions. Why are you experiencing homelessness? And you'll get a list of answers like this. I lost my job, I got in a fight, my husband beat me up, I drink too much, whatever the case may be. And then the Seattle Times, in our case, will publish these and say, these are the causes of homelessness. And I scratch my head a little bit. And this is not to say that I don't honor these responses. These are absolutely essential. Domestic violence in the wrong set of circumstances can absolutely produce homelessness, right? Getting in a fight with your family, with your roommate can certainly lead to a bout of homelessness. But what Clayton and I try to do in this book is to draw a distinction between what we believe to be the root causes of homelessness and what we would call precipitating events. Divorce, I don't believe is the root cause of homelessness. I believe it can be a precipitating event, right? We could have a national anti-divorce initiative, and I don't know that that would have a huge impact on homelessness. I'm not necessarily in favor of divorce, but the point being that in certain circumstances, these events can produce homelessness while in other circumstances they don't. And that's really important to understand. So to highlight the difference between a precipitating event and a root cause, let's think about the game of musical chairs. We've got 10 friends who are playing a game. The leader starts the music. Everyone starts walking around in a circle. The leader takes one chair away, and now we have 10 people and 9 chairs. And when the music stops, everyone scrambles for a chair. And in this case, Mike loses the game. Mike was on crutches because he'd hurt his ankle and wasn't able to move quickly when the music stopped. And so if ESPN were there covering the sporting event and they asked Mike afterwards, why'd you lose the game, Mike? What would he say? It's like, I had a bad ankle, right? And that's certainly true within the confines of the game. 10 people, 9 chairs, Mike's ankle injury probably did cause him to lose the game. But if we think a little bit more critically, we would all understand that the reason Mike didn't have a chair is because there weren't enough chairs. And this is really what's happening in our coastal cities right now, is when housing is scarce, people who are vulnerable, people who are subject to systemic racism, people who have a health challenge are the ones who are losing this game. We have a competitive game of housing, and its scarcity produces losers. And the people who are most likely not to find a chair or not to find a housing unit are those who are vulnerable in some way, shape, or form. And so when we see someone on the street corner who is struggling with behavioral health challenges, it shouldn't surprise us that that person loses the game when we don't have sufficient access to housing. So we know that drug use and mental illness and poverty, these individual factors certainly do increase the risk of homelessness at the individual level. There's no doubt about that. Neither Clay nor I would ever suggest otherwise. But we also know that those conditions produce homelessness in some contexts and not others. And so we should really understand what is going on here. So the fundamental question that we ask in the book is, why do rates of homelessness vary so widely throughout the United States? For example, why does Seattle have 5 times the per capita rate of homelessness of Chicago? Okay. Does Los Angeles have a big homelessness problem because it has more people with these individual vulnerabilities, right? So if drug use is a causal driver of homelessness, it is plausible to then say, well, then maybe more drug use in a community would produce more homelessness. Perfectly logical explanation that proves to be false. So this is a book about cities, not about people. Okay, and this doesn't mean that person-centered research on homelessness isn't important. It absolutely is. But what this book is trying to understand is what the heck is going on in Boston, New York, DC, Seattle, San Francisco, and LA. That's the purpose of this book. And we want to understand that regional variation. And the point of this variation is really important because these are huge differences, 5 times, right? We're not talking 20, 30% differences. We're talking about 5 times. Okay. And the thesis of the book is that tight housing markets accentuate vulnerabilities. And these vulnerabilities then serve as a sorting mechanism to identify the people who are most likely to experience homelessness when housing is scarce. So just to orient you and give you a visual picture of what variation looks like in the United States, one thing that's really important is some jurisdictions count homelessness at the city level and some places count at the county level. Neither one is right or wrong. It's just a decision that local jurisdictions make. And so when you're comparing, you need to make sure that you're comparing apples to apples. And so we need to compare cities to cities. I cannot compare King County, Washington to New York City because all else equal, locations with that include the suburbs, county locations, will have lower rates of homelessness. And so when we look at cities, our sample is about the 30 largest metro areas in the United States. You'll see New York is about 5 times Indianapolis, about 10 per capita versus 2 per capita. So there's about a 5-to-1 relationship between New York and Indianapolis. When we move to counties, the numbers are lower because of this suburban phenomenon. Suburban homelessness is lower than in the urban core. But what's really interesting is, again, what we see is about a 5-to-1 relationship. LA County is about 5 times Hillsborough County, which is Tampa, Florida. So that 5-to-1 relationship is what we're really interested in explaining in this book. So there are all sorts of explanations that compete for attention. And so we look at 3 categories of explanations to see if they help us understand this regional variation. The first one, and the most obvious, is poverty. Poverty causes homelessness. There's no doubt about it. And you'll see a few of these graphs coming up in the next few slides, just to orient you that the bottom axis in this case would be the poverty rate, the percentage of people below the poverty line. And the y-axis, or the vertical axis, is the rate of homelessness. And so each dot represents a city in a year or a county in a year. What's interesting here is that there is some statistical relationship between these 2 things, but it's in the opposite direction of what you would think. Places with higher rates of poverty tend to have lower rates of homelessness. Think Detroit, Michigan. It's the most impoverished city in the country, but has far lower rates of homelessness than very affluent cities like Seattle and San Francisco. So at a community level, poverty doesn't drive homelessness, although we know at the individual level it does. This is a head scratcher, right? In the academy, we'd call this a unit of analysis issue. Okay. So poverty doesn't explain regional variation. This is rates of serious mental illness. These data are at the state level. The state level data is better than city data on drug use and mental illness. The point of this slide is that there's basically no relationship between rates of serious mental illness and homelessness. There are people who are experiencing serious mental illness in every state in the nation. And there is some variation. Some places have more, some places have less, but has 0 bearing on rates of homelessness. So New York State and Washington State and California don't have more homelessness because we have more people experiencing mental illness. The consequences of mental illness are different in some places, and we'll get to that in a moment. But this is not about who is in these communities. Same story here with illicit drug use. That R squared of 0.06 basically means there's no relationship. There are people using illicit drugs in every state in the nation. It doesn't have a bearing on overall rates of homelessness. Race. The purpose of this slide is to demonstrate that race doesn't cause homelessness. Racism causes homelessness, right? There is no relationship. You don't have more, while Black and African-American people are 3 to 4 times overrepresented in the homeless population, having more Black or African-American people in your community doesn't produce more homelessness, okay? Race collides with discriminatory and racist systems and institutions to produce disproportionate rates of homelessness, but race doesn't explain regional variation. Seattle, for example, is a disproportionately white community, but we have some of the highest rates of homelessness in the nation. So we dispense with some of the individual explanations in that chapter, and then we move to this idea of local context. And I will tell you, I hear this all the time. What is going on in our community to produce this? What is going on in Seattle? We must be doing something wrong. The first thing I always hear is, well, look at the weather. The weather is so nice in Seattle. And it's like, well, it's rainy and 39 in January. And then people say, well, LA and San Diego, it's nice. Of course they have homelessness. And then I say, well, what about Miami and Dallas and Phoenix, which are also pleasant in January? They don't have the same problem that West Coast cities and East Coast cities do. And so when we plot rates of homelessness, what we see is there's almost no relationship whatsoever between weather and homelessness. New York and Boston are not very pleasant in January, but they still have high rates of homelessness. Okay, so this narrative that moderate weather produces homelessness is inaccurate. Weather does impact the policy response, whether you have shelter or not. And we talk about that in the book. We don't have time to discuss that today. So the policy response can be impacted by weather, but overall levels of homelessness are not driven by weather. We frequently hear discussions about magnet effects in the sense that if we provide generous benefits, people are then going to congregate in certain municipalities and therefore produce high rates of homelessness. So this is based on TANF, the primary federal welfare program, which largely goes to women and children. This is at the state level. There's huge state variation in the generosity of TANF. And so we can actually test and say, do generous states then end up serving as a magnet for homelessness? Do we see more homelessness in states with really generous TANF benefits? And we don't. Actually, we see zero relationship. There are stingy states, there are generous states, has no bearing on rates of homelessness. People aren't congregating in generous states. There are narratives in every community that people are moving here to experience homelessness. And so this is one where we look at rates of low-income migration. So this would be the percentage of people below the federal poverty line moving to cities and counties. And what we see is there's actually a negative relationship. Are there some poor people moving to Seattle and San Francisco? Yes, there are, but at very, very low rates. In fact, we see much higher rates of low-income migration in other jurisdictions that have relatively low rates of homelessness. So the point of this is that the homelessness problem in New York and in Seattle, it is largely speaking a homegrown problem. The people experiencing homelessness in those jurisdictions, for the most part, are from those communities. We're not importing the problem. So the final category of explanations we look at is the housing market. And this is where we start to see some real statistical relationship between two variables. So this is just median contract rent. Where rent is high, homelessness is high. And I joke that no one's going to give us a Nobel Prize for this slide, but this is really the punchline. A related slide is vacancy rates. When vacancy rates are low, homelessness tends to be much higher. And you can see these R-squareds, which is a statistical measure, are much higher than what we saw in the other slides. So the point here is that if you just said, hey, Greg, here's the rent and here's the vacancy rate in a community, I could tell you with a fairly high degree of confidence whether that community is going to have a problem with homelessness or not. I'm just getting my time check here. Thank you. So the question then becomes well, why do some places have really high rents and low vacancies? If this is really a driver of this crisis, we should want to understand that. And so one way that we try to do this is certainly the demand for housing. When people move to a community, that will have an impact on housing costs and supply or access to housing. But we also need to think about the supply side of housing, which is in an economic term would be the elasticity, meaning when prices go up, how much housing do we supply? And economists have done this work and demonstrated that the topography of a community impacts its supply elasticity. If you have challenging topography with mountains and water, it restricts your ability to build more housing when prices go up. And the regulatory environment in which you try to build housing has a big impact. And so really, when you think about inelastic housing supply, meaning you don't build much housing, think of San Francisco. It's the most inelastic housing supply in the country. You have very challenging topography, lots of water and mountains, and you have a very, very restrictive regulatory environment. And so as people have moved to San Francisco and driven prices up, we haven't built sufficient housing there, and this housing crisis has continued. And so what we can do here is plot these relationships on a graph, the x-axis being a proxy for housing demand, change in population, and the y-axis being housing supply elasticity, meaning how much housing do you build. The lower right quadrant really is the perfect storm for a housing crisis, which is rapid population growth and very inelastic housing supply. And you can see these numbers in parentheses are vacancy rates. And so San Francisco, Boston, Seattle, very, very robust growth, limited housing supply, you get very low vacancy rates, high rents, and you have a housing crisis. The upper right-hand quadrant to me is very interesting. These are Sunbelt cities that have grown just as fast as Boston and Seattle, but they've built a heck of a lot of housing. Right? They have very, very high housing supply elasticity. And as a result, they've been able to maintain relatively high vacancy rates and more modest rents. Now, Austin is kind of the canary in the coal mine for the Sun Belt right now because it is failing to keep up over the last couple of years. This is based on 2019 data. What we're seeing is rents are increasing dramatically in Austin, vacancy rates are falling, and the problem of homelessness is becoming far more significant in Austin. So that's one that we really need to watch, and that's a warning sign for other Sun Belt communities that if you take your foot off the gas pedal in terms of housing production, you could end up falling into a category that looks a lot more like New York or Seattle than Charlotte, North Carolina, for example. So I'm going to wrap up here. I'm at time. But the real point here is that we have expended lots of money in the United States and certainly in New York City responding to the crisis of homelessness. And I would never suggest that these are wasted investments because they are life-saving, right? The emergency response to homelessness is essential, and we're providing much needed services and supports to people who are experiencing a crisis. But we're fooling ourselves if we think that these responses are going to end the crisis of homelessness. It's a response to, not an intervention to end homelessness. So we need to pair these life-saving operating investments with capital investments to construct housing that's affordable for people with low incomes. We need to do both if we're going to try to end this crisis of homelessness. And where housing is difficult to construct, such as in Seattle and San Francisco, where we have lots of single-family zoning, we need to think about how we use our land, right? We need a much denser city to be able to accommodate all the people who want to live here. And so to wrap up here, what I want to stress here is that if we continue to diagnose homelessness as a problem of the individual, we will undermine our efforts to prevent and end it. This is a structural problem, and structural responses are therefore needed. And provision of housing is a structural response. And so the last thing I want to say here is that people say, well, Greg, how do you know that housing will end homelessness? And I'll say, because we have done it. The United States made a commitment 10 years ago that they didn't want veterans to experience homelessness like they did in the Vietnam generation. So men and women coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, leaders of both political parties said, we want to prioritize housing. And what do? We gave people housing. In some cases, it was a unit. In some cases, it was a unit plus services. In some cases, it was a voucher. And we cut veteran homelessness by 50%. Housing ends homelessness. We have demonstrated that in the past with our veterans. The question is, will we extend that logic to a broader population of people? And that's a question of political ideology and values and resource allocation, et cetera. Thank you for your time, and I really look forward to this conversation with my fellow panelists.
Thank you, Greg. Sorry, I'm making sure that I can click a button here. Thank you, Greg. I think we can all sort of let this sink in for a moment here, because, the content of this presentation has so much impact. Even if you've read the book or seen the presentation before, it really is this sort of ironclad, or I should say this really rigorous examination of all the myths and misconceptions that I think people offhandedly use to casually explain the phenomenon of homelessness, and putting it in this structure really changes the conversation for us in a way that I think is really helpful. So I wanted to start our discussion by asking, well, we've discarded all these alternative explanations for what are the root causes of homelessness, what accounts for the variation among cities and regions in homelessness. What are the implications of those misunderstandings? First, before we even get into what to do about it, but what are some of the implications that those misunderstandings have had for people experiencing homelessness and for policy towards homelessness and housing? And I'll start first with our panelists, with Rob and then Jessica.
So thank you, Howard, and thank you, Greg, for your slide deck. It was very powerful. I think for me, what brought me to this work are some of the points that Greg brought up in the book. It's painted as an individual issue, where I saw it as a structural problem, right? And not everybody going through quote unquote homelessness has the ability to think through it in that way. But as a distinguished professor of geography at the City University of New York Graduate Center once asked me, how did you have the time to theorize about what you were going through? And I said, for 2.5 years, I had nothing else to do but think. So I might as well think positively and try to figure out solution to the problem. So I think the implications is shame, right? People paint this issue with what I like to refer to as the broad brush. And it made me very angry. Once I came out of shelter and understood this ongoing issue, I refused to be touched with what I call that broad brush. You're not painting me with that broad brush. And I need to find others who have gone through what I went through so that they can share their stories. And once you share stories, you have data, right? Once you have data, it reveals trends, right? And you have to convince people who went through this that collecting data is a good thing, because people who come from certain neighborhoods see data as surveillance. So you have to switch that narrative. It's a lot of work involved in this stuff. And really, and it's the reason why I continue 17, 18 years later to continually share my story, to say it's okay to share your story. Don't be painted with the broad brush, and don't buy into the narratives. So I think what you do is, in essence, to answer the question, if you don't speak out about it, you stand the chance of being painted into a corner and never being able to get out from underneath this thing called homelessness. You're muted, Howard.
Of course I am. I'm so sorry. Jessica, is there anything you want to add in terms of the implications of misconceptions and misunderstandings on both the experience of people experiencing homelessness and the policies towards homelessness and housing?
Sure. So first of all, I just want to thank my fellow panelists, CHPC, for continuing the drumbeat that homelessness is a housing problem and seeing that as part of your extremely important mission. And Howard, thank you so much for taking my baby and putting it in such good hands. I'm really, really proud to have you as my successor. Rob, always, for being such a great partner to me and helping me think through the most difficult issues. And Gregg, I am green with envy over your PowerPoint, and I feel like I'm a pretty good PowerPoint person. I think it's such an important contribution to the narrative around housing and homelessness here in New York, where I think Howard used the word casual. I think that's a really important word. I think any given person at a dinner table, at your Thanksgiving table, could come up with 10 reasons that we feel very confident in, casually, kind of anecdotally, about why homelessness is a particular issue. And it almost makes me want to kind of use you, Gregg, as like a hotline of, okay, okay, it's not because it's temperate in the winter. What if it's not too hot in the summer? Like, do average temperature in July, do 10 other reasons, do available access to subways, do all the other kind of casual reasons why people kind of assume, give me the fentanyl data, give me all the other reasons why we kind of assume, that either New York is exceptional or LA is a great place to live if you're homeless, or things like that. So I think we're really trying to look under every rock in this world to try to come up with some other answer about why homelessness and why homelessness here. And we get kind of cavalier and casual about it at times. So I think seeing that data in black and white is incredibly powerful, especially for a city of like New York, who, we often don't like to be compared to other cities very much. So seeing us kind of in the context of all the other cities working just right on the curve of that graph, I think is really important and humbling for New York City to start to develop a language around homeless as a structural housing problem, as opposed to people in need of services will need services until they get better or until we provide them, and then we will deal with the housing later. Which also speaks to some of the other pieces. I think your slide about welfare benefits, I have like 10 more research projects for you about various benefits, because I think that's a common, and legitimate concern here in New York City, because we do invest so much money in those safety net programs and in our shelter system. And we want to make sure that people only use it if they absolutely need to. So really wanting to decouple those myths from the data that we've seen. And then making sure that once we have provided those services and those programs, they're as easy to use for people who need them as humanly possible. So I think the work that CHPC started around administrative burdens and the brutal bureaucracy, to make sure that once we do have this ability to help, we're putting people in the best possible position to be able to take advantage of that help as well.
And I want to build on some of what you were just saying, Jessica, in terms of...
Do you mind if I just respond to that question?
No, please, go ahead.
Really short. I think this is really, really important for those of us who are going about our lives in cities. When we blame the individual here, it absolves us of some sense of responsibility. And that is absolutely essential. And the problem is when we confront this as a structural issue, that means that we all own it. And that's scary, right? And I think that's really important. And that kind of well-intentioned moderates, right, in all of these cities fall into that category. And boy, if I can look at Joe and say, boy, Joe made some really poor decisions, not my fault, I can go about my day. When I see Joe and say, wow, this is a problem of our collective making, that then demands us to respond. And that's what we're wrestling with right now in Seattle and New York and in these cities. Sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to make that comment.
Yeah, and I'll also add that I think people are pretty casual about homelessness as a category of people. We try really hard in my narrative in government and outside government to use the phrase people experiencing homelessness. On the West Coast, people have other kind of phrases that have been kind of are the kind of most modern phrase to use around homelessness. I think that phrase is important to me, not just as some sort of token of humanity that I'm like benevolently granting somebody who's experiencing homelessness, but because of that structural factor, right? If there's a homeless person, then I get to imbue them with all the characteristics that I've decided that homeless people have. They must have made bad decisions. They must have had some problems that are outside of my control, at least to solve, and outside of my responsibility to solve, both as a government employee and as a New Yorker. So I think that phrase, we don't say like, oh, those left-handed people doing that thing again, or, oh, let's help the left-handed people do this other thing. So that it sounds like a silly comparison, but it is a silly comparison. There's no the characteristics of somebody who are no longer has an apartment. We see in the data that all these other excuses and explanations do not bear that out as a category, but we're very quick every time there's a story to kind of imbue that with everybody who's homeless. And again, that's not for some sort of generic like kumbaya about wanting to treat everyone with respect, although I do. It's really more about if we're going to attack the problem, we have to really see it clearly for what it is.
I just want to make sure no one else has anything to add, because Rob, I couldn't be more glad that you did jump in there. Not Rob, Greg, I'm sorry. I couldn't be more glad that you did jump in there, because I think you've really highlighted the subtext of responsibility that exists here. And that is tied to both the way that the public, that we all perceive the issue, and to what it means for action, right? If this is something that we have a shared responsibility for, that is a systemic problem, that is about our ability to provide enough for everyone, then that changes the conversation from, well, whose fault is it that this happened, to, well, whose fault is it that happened? And that's a very different kind of conversation, and one that I think is picking up some speed here in New York City and in New York State, but as well as elsewhere around the country. I wanted to step back to this question of putting New York City, how New York City doesn't like to be compared to other cities, but it's a really healthy thing for us to do sometimes. And Greg, maybe you can give us a little bit of texture in terms of what you've found through your research, and the rest of the panel can respond to this. That in what ways is New York City similar to the other big 6 cities that you've identified in your research, and in what ways might it be different in some ways that would be significant for us?
Well, I would say, New York is the epicenter to the homelessness story in the United States, right? A lot of things have happened first in New York. A lot of amazing research has happened in New York. And so you can't understand homelessness in the United States without understanding New York City. I will say the most fascinating difference right now is the East Coast versus West Coast shelter model. New York has largely a sheltered homeless population, not entirely, but let's say 95%. And that was driven by litigation decades ago. And ultimately, a very robust shelter system was built in New York City to serve people experiencing homelessness. I frequently hear in Seattle, people come back and say, I was just in New York and they don't have a problem with homelessness. And I say, well, au contraire, right? They have the largest homeless population in the United States. They're hiding it better than we are. That's a really, really important point. And for those people who have either lived in shelters, I have never lived in a shelter, I've never experienced homelessness, but I've been in a lot of shelters and interviewed people. They're not pleasant places. And that's not for a lack of effort. The people staffing shelters are wonderful, wonderful people. It is not a pleasant place to go through life. And so the East Coast is largely warehousing people in a shelter system because there aren't places for people to go. right? People can live in those shelters for years and years and years. And so the real question confronting big cities right now is in the West Coast, where we have, let's say, a 50-50 unsheltered, sheltered population, is, do we build New York 2.0, which is a very robust shelter system to get people off the streets? Then you've got this huge shelter system that consumes billions and billions and billions of dollars year after year after year. That's a difficult question. And I always say, be careful what you wish for, because if we build a shelter system and don't build the permanent housing that's needed for people to get out, we will end up with New York 2.0. And I think a lot of people would probably say that's not an ideal circumstance. So that's a real challenge. I would say the other thing where New York differs from the rest of the country is your land use, right? My first job out of college was in New York City. I lived at 88th and Broadway, and I always joke and said, if you want to build single family housing at 88th and Broadway, people would think you're crazy. But yet in Chicago and Seattle and San Francisco, we can have a single family home, 5 minutes from a major sports stadium. It's ridiculous. And so our land use is going to need to look a lot more like New York than it does right now in Seattle, San Francisco, LA, Chicago, et cetera. So anyway, the point to summarize, and where New York fits into the story, is New York has very expensive housing and it's scarce. And therefore you're going to end up with a homelessness crisis, which you have for a long time.
So sort of a direct response to Gregg. I agree about the complexities of the problems of New York. I'm currently working on a research project for the London School of Economics, a professor and a student there. And we've been doing things the same way since the 90s. It's problematic. The world has changed around us, right? So you're stuck in a place with this model and it's not working. This model just keeps expanding and expanding so that you're warehousing more and more people. Not the answer. We have to think outside of the box. But I also think we are offered some big challenges here. And you didn't go too much into this. I wish you could have, Gregg, about land itself and the commodification of land in New York. That makes it extremely difficult. Jessica can speak more to this based on her background, but just as somebody who studied the acquisition and land use in New York, it's commodified to a fact that air rights are for sale, right? So you have to go straight up because it's profitable, but then it becomes so highly profitable that people don't want to build affordable housing. The developers want to build a luxury housing. So you run into a bit of a political problem. It's complicated. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that it's easy. It's not. It's a bunch of things that play into one another and makes this problem more and more difficult, but we need to think outside of the box. And currently, I think we're still thinking the same way as my research, the work that I'm doing in the research area, says we're still doing the same work, the same things that we were doing in the 90s, and that's a big problem.
This is Robin, my favorite debate. We've been having it for, I don't want to say how many decades, and I hope we have it for decades more into the future. I think in my experience in government in New York City is that we've actually created a very wide range of tools to create affordable housing. And at this moment, I actually have a huge line out the door of developers who are really seeking to develop affordable housing. And we're kind of shoveling the resources out the door as quickly as we can and trying to make sure that we ask for more than ever before. One thing that in this moment is really valuable is that for years and years, we had this debate about affordable for whom. Right. So we're building affordable housing, but is that really affordable? Is it affordable enough for a homeless person? Is it affordable enough for someone on a fixed income? And there was various sides of people who thought that was a silly debate because there's a line out the door no matter what we build. And then there was people who are taking that argument as being a reason not to build anything and all kinds of varying arguments in between. I think that debate has been largely ground to a halt over the past year or two, as we have partially from the federal government and partially from the city government, seen a huge influx of rental subsidies into New York City, either through the president's program after the ARP program after COVID, as well as through the City FEPS program. So at this point, the affordability question around AMI levels in some ways is largely moot because I have literally tens of thousands of people who have a voucher who are looking for an apartment. So that's depressing because we fought really hard for all of these voucher programs and now we're struggling to use them as quickly as we would like, but it's also an opportunity to reset the discussion around housing supply and making sure that we have enough housing supply to if we can't even, if someone with the gold standard Section 8 voucher can't even find a unit in New York, that that we really have a serious housing supply problem. And that if we can provide that rental subsidy, and there will never, the housing market, you're right, Rob, will never provide housing that could create somebody who, at 5, 10, 15% of AMI. That's what the voucher is for. But at this point, we have a place where for many years, if you had a voucher, that was your golden ticket. That's kind of somewhat suddenly, it feels, is no longer the case anymore, as we had a huge influx of vouchers and a huge constriction in the housing market. But I think that opens up a more rational debate around housing supply here in New York City that I think we're starting to have. So it's going to be an interesting year for that discussion. And those vouchers even the playing field significantly. And when even that is not enough, I think then we have to start dispelling myths around the supply skeptics and realize that we just need to build some more, and that we do have the subsidies in place to support people even at extremely low incomes.
Jessica, I want to build on that and start to weave in some of the questions that people have been sending in the Q&A box. And so I will be paraphrasing and maybe merging a couple of the different questions that people have had. And one of them was about not quite this question, affordable for whom, but really connected to that. We're talking about, the people that we are vulnerable to becoming homeless are people at very low incomes or with irregular incomes. How can we, think of the kind of housing that needs to be added as the kind of housing that will meet that need? But I wanted to sort of qualify that question a little bit and toss it back to Gregg for a moment, which is that I didn't see anything in the research that you presented about whether the housing that was being built in these other cities was subsidized or affordable. And I just want to sort of ask as an open question, is there, the affordable for whom question is certainly a short-term question, which is that someone needs a unit, they need to get into a unit. How can they get into a unit? But how much is it also a long-term a sort of issue in terms of this structural undersupply that you're identifying here in your book?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we could spend hours on that. And so what I'm going to do is try to distill this down into a very short comment, which is the graphs that I showed today are just housing units, period, right? Vacancy rates are vacancy rates overall. To follow up on Jessica's point, the scarcity of housing in our coastal cities creates a challenge because, one, it increases the likelihood someone will slip into homelessness, because any unfortunate event can produce that bout of homelessness pretty quickly because of its cost. And it also makes getting out much more difficult because the resources and the tools that we know work don't work well. The prime example being people not being able to use vouchers in Seattle and New York City, or people not being able to scale Housing First, which is a demonstrably good intervention for homelessness, but you need a unit to use Housing First, right? And so this scarcity creates a bigger problem and makes it much harder to get out. And so I would never suggest that just building $1 million condos or $1 million apartment buildings is going to end homelessness. That is not the purpose of the book. Do we need more expensive housing in New York and Seattle? Yes, we do, because those people are looking for housing as well. We need housing at all levels. And so the government can make sure we incent private market construction of housing, and we should do that, land use, et cetera. And then we also can use levers of government to demonstrate that we need subsidy, either to the individual or to the construction of housing, such that someone at 5, 10, 15% of area median income can afford housing. That's where government should be focused its attention right now. And a lot of good work is being done there. To date, the scale of the problem has been bigger than the scale of the response. And that's what we need to do. But it's a super complicated question, and that was an insufficient response, I think.
Certainly.
I also want to go back to your comment, Gregg, about ending veterans homelessness and the experience of going through that process on the government side here in New York City. I think that was a powerful process for a few reasons. And then we also sort of failed to follow up on it for a few important reasons. On the one hand, because we viewed it as a finite problem, it also created the kind of, it created a sense of momentum around how solvable it was, right? There was a X number of homeless people. It wasn't of homeless veterans there. We did not have the perception that there would be thousands more coming up behind the current group of homeless veterans. Although there's some movement in and out of the system, obviously it felt like a specific cadre of people who were stuck in our shelter system for a long time. There were significant additional resources that were brought to bear from the federal government specifically to solve the problem. There was a diversity of resources. It wasn't just one thing. So it was a little bit of supportive housing, a little bit of short-term vouchers, a little bit of technical assistance. There was a range of different options for people who needed different types of interventions or different kind of, we didn't think that there was one answer to the problem. So that was really helpful. And because it was for homeless veterans, it kind of solved two political problems, right? It was sort of by definition, we decided that this was like the good kind of homeless person, right? We weren't going to give somebody something extra that they didn't need or didn't deserve. We all agreed that this was a group of people who were worthy of our help and our attention and our focus. And then because it was veterans, we didn't feel like we needed to debate a draw to the system, right? No one's gonna there was no immediate jumping to the Thanksgiving table of, oh, well, then they're just gonna all go join the army so then they can come back out, become homeless, and then get this awesome voucher that you're gonna give them. So I think that kind of decoupled some of the more toxic elements of the debate and allowed us to move forward kind of in lockstep together as a system to be able to solve that problem. And to this day, I believe New York City is under our functional zero for veterans homelessness because we really did kind of lock in that set of systems and procedures to make sure that we can move veterans through the system quickly. That said, what we didn't do, which I think was part of the intention of the program, was then loop back and say, if we know how to fix this for veterans, if we know how to create a variety of solutions for people who have a variety of needs, and if we know how to create a fast track over here, now let's loop back and figure out what's stopping us from doing it for the system as a whole. That is the process that we're attempting to undergo now. It's a slog. It is something that it is a system-wide question around where the bottlenecks are in our process and even where there are resources, what's stopping us. In some cases, that's housing supply. In many cases, it is, but in other cases, we're getting in our own way. But I think veterans homelessness had some really important kind of, again, structural factors that made it a great place to start. And then I'm not sure that we took the full benefit. I won't speak to other places in the country. In New York, I think we didn't take the full benefit of how to spread that process and that gospel and that systematic look at what we're doing with to try to address veterans homelessness across a broader population of homeless families.
Howard, I just want to just jump in and agree with a quick comment around what Jessica laid out. I think the political piece with respect to Washington, D.C. was the important part of it. Who these folks were. These are veterans that are homeless. And they zeroed in, man, because there's a shame associated with this, right? And when you get folks like myself and others who go to Geneva constantly to the UN and expose the US, it's a little bit of embarrassment associated with it. So they focused, and I give them a lot of credit because it was, as Jessica said, something that they could go in and drill down on. But where was the follow-up? I do think, to give Washington a little credit and the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, they are taking some steps back and rethinking that process and looking in a little closer. But I do have the advantage of participating in focus groups with the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness.
Yeah, well, and in the veterans conversation, it kind of sweeps away a lot of what's in, Greg, your slides, right? It kind of lets us avoid it just swept away the conversation of, well, what if they're mentally ill? What if they're substance abusers? What if they're this? Veterans kind of trumped all of that. So it allowed us to sidestep a lot of the debates that seem to get in the way of us addressing homelessness in a systemic way. So there was some really nice, we tied that up in a bow really nicely in the veterans homelessness piece. And I think your work, I hope, will help us move the discussion forward, that will help us do that for homelessness more broadly and kind of assume, not assume personal pathology and assign personal pathology as that core reason for everybody, and assume that everybody kind of deserves and needs our help in a way that can help us move forward systemically.
Building on that example, so we want to talk about, at CHPC, we're always interested in what are the solutions, what are the practical things that we can focus on. So you've already seized on one model that we can look to in terms of what's been done to relieve or eliminate veteran homelessness. And I want to think about that at both the local level and the state and the federal level, which you've all alluded to already, in terms of resources, in terms of policies. What are other successes that we can point to, and what are other things that we might need or want to see in terms of federal and state policy as well as local policy? I'll throw that open to the floor for anyone.
I'm gonna take advantage of jumping in here. While I believe in the hope count, I believe geographically it plays out differently for different regions. We're in New York. The last week in January is bitter cold. Number of people on the streets are minimal, right? They're going to find some place that's warm. Even if it's a subway grade on the E train at 53rd and Lex, it's warm down there. I ain't on the streets, right? So if you want to get a better count, let's also have a second count for certain geographical regions. The last Monday in July, it's warm. People are up in the parks. You're going to get a truer assessment and more visibility with respect to homelessness. So I think that's one place to start. One of the reasons why I enjoy my relationship and the working relationship that I have with Jessica is because I say Jessica gets it. Jessica created a homeless and housing roundtable where she brought people who were directly impacted to the table to have discussions. She doesn't see herself as an expert. I need to learn from the people with lived experiences, and she's not afraid to say that. And I think the other big plus, and I rub government's faces in this across the country, is Jessica created a blueprint for homelessness and housing. Much like homelessness is a housing problem, our predecessors had a separate homeless blueprint and a separate housing, but it makes no sense. She was the first to boldly say, I'm putting these two together. So on a broad way, while I didn't hone in on specific solutions, I think that's the starting point. You bring people directly impacted to the table, not to be on the menu, but to be a part of the conversation, to start to develop ideas for making things better for people. And I think that's a huge step. So, big ups to Jessica and her group for doing that. It's why I have my foot, like I like to say, inside of City Hall, not a place I'm comfortable being, but as long as she's in that position, I'll have my foot inside of City Hall.
Thank you so much, Rob. So I want to make a plug for the Hope Count also. I think that there's dozens of folks on this call right now trying to figure out, so if I'm starting to peek in the door to see if there's any kind of personal responsibility that I can take and what can I do. I think if there's any skeptics left on this call around homelessness being a structural housing problem, the Hope Count is a really great place to kind of dispel those myths, right? So the way that the Hope Count is structured, and it was only a few weeks ago, so you'll have to wait till next January to do it. But the way that it's structured is that you volunteer in teams and you go all around the city, and everyone that you meet, you stop people. It starts at midnight. Everyone you meet, you stop them and say, hi, I'm a volunteer with the city, and I'd like to ask you a few questions. So that was odd to me at first, because I can tell with my eyes who's homeless and who's walking to work or who's going home from a club or anything like that. So it's awkward at first to stop somebody who you think you know who they are and what they're doing in this world outside on the street in New York at midnight on the first Monday in January. But then every time I've done it year after year, there's someone on there that surprises me. There's someone who I think, oh, this person is going to say, can't you see I'm standing outside of this bar having a cigarette? And the first question you ask them is, do you have a place to stay tonight? And always, at least once, if not more than once, you get this flicker of someone being surprised that you asked them, and they say no. And it's not someone that you would have been able to peg, like the way that you walk onto the subway and think, I know who's homeless on this train and who's not. You don't. So if there's some kind of there's some gut feeling in your mind that says like, yeah, but I actually do kind of know and I can kind of tell, I would really encourage you to try the Hope Count and give that a shot. Thanks for the shout out on the blueprint. I think that was really intentional. That's a scary place to be for a new mayoral administration, to try to take some responsibility for homelessness. There's some really good reasons to keep them separate, because then you can kind of declare victory in some areas and even while you're struggling in others. So that is something that we consciously decided not to do despite the risks of it. But I think it's just a really important narrative for us to continue to realize that these two problems are closely linked and they're actually the same problem. And then the other thing that I'll just close on is that one reason why we know that homelessness is a housing problem is because the data shows us this amazing book, this wonderful presentation, and all these fantastic R-squareds. But it's not just the R-squared that tells us that homelessness is a housing problem. Homeless people are telling us that every single day. So I think bringing all of our impacted advocates into City Hall and asking, what do you need? Not one person said, oh, if I just had, no one was telling me about their personal stories of why they became homeless. Everyone said, if I had housing, then I wouldn't be homeless anymore. So that's another, when you hear that from both the human experience and the data, you really have to start to change how we're doing business. And I hope that this can be the start of that.
Well, we have time, I think, for probably one, possibly two more questions, but I wanted to segue from Jessica, what you were just saying, to the question of, well, we've all looked at R-squareds and charts and a great presentation of them. And, for those of us who appreciate quantitative, evidence and proof, this all is extremely persuasive. And Jessica, you've highlighted, and certainly Rob, you've highlighted as well, just listening to people and what people have to say about what they've experienced is a huge part of this. How do we use this information and both the quantitative and the experiential information we have to change public perceptions and attitudes, right? We have a great group. I'm looking at the number of people we have in the room today, who can all absorb and digest and disseminate this kind of understanding. But what is it that prevents us from getting further in getting the public to appreciate what seems kind of commonsensical once you've absorbed it all? How can we use this information to change hearts and minds? Other than everyone should buy Gregg's book, which I think we're making sure that we provide a link for that at the end of this conversation.
In addition to that important suggestion, here's what I think is really important. And this is why being an elected leader or a member of government in one of our coastal cities is really hard. Is because people will say, we just spent X and X has lots of zeros on it and the problem has gotten worse. Therefore, X isn't working. And that to me is something that we have to fight every single day, that the investments that we're making are life-saving and that they're housing people. I was just on a call at UCLA last week. They're housing 21,000 people last year. The problem is 24,000 people entered homelessness, right? So the investments are working. The problem is that the flow into homelessness is still so significant. And so I think everyone on this call, we need to have a very concerted effort to highlight the fact that investments are necessary, they're life-saving. It would be much worse if we didn't have them. And we need to make sure that we scale the investments to the scale of the problem. Otherwise, we're going to continue to have this. Because my great fear, and we're seeing this in Seattle, is that, and I said this on the National Research Council for the Alliance to End Homelessness, my great fear is that you've got Obama and Biden voters who are saying, get these people out of Seattle. I'm sick and tired of this. People who otherwise consider themselves to be compassionate and moderate type folks are saying, I can't handle this anymore. Ship them to Wenatchee, which is on the other side of the Cascades. And unless we communicate the relationship between these investments and the crisis, that's the type of responses we're going to get. And I'm very, very concerned as a nation and in our cities that that's where we're headed.
Yeah, I think some of these myths are unfortunately bipartisan in nature. So there's a couple questions in the Q&A about, liberal cities not living our values or kind of trying to frame the ideology around this. And it is ideology. It's just that it's an ideology that fits very neatly into both a liberal and a conservative worldview. So it has the bad luck of falling comfortably into both worldviews in a way that kind of hurts homeless people from the left and from the right at times.
So I'm a big believer in education. I think people with lived experience combining with academics who are open-minded and don't think they know everything. I got brought into academia by Neil Smith, who challenged me to come and lecture his PhD students when I said I had an undergraduate degree. And I said I couldn't. And he got in my face and said, you taught me, you're going to teach my students. So to bring those two forces together, I think are important. But we have to be open-minded about it, right? So I get into a lot of spaces. I mentioned to Greg, I know Sarah Rankin at the University of Seattle. I know the Slatkin Institute at UCLA. I've been on panels with them. So I get into a lot of these spaces, but we have to widen that circle. We have to broaden and open that circle and bring more community members together, policymakers, all in the same space. I tell my students all the time, I lived through this. This is my personal experience. This is what I lived through during my time, and it's the history as I understand it. I'm giving you a toolbox to go change the world. So I think we have to influence our young folks who are coming along, who see the world a little bit differently than the way that we were exposed to it and the way that we saw it. So, you know, education is the way for me.
That's a great note on which to end our conversation for today. Hopefully this has been an education for everyone here. It certainly has been for me. I want to take a moment just to thank all our panelists again, Gregg Colburn, Rob Robinson, Jessica Katz. We want to encourage you to come back to our website at chpcny.org for more information about upcoming events, and read the book, Homelessness is a Housing Problem, available. We have a link in the chat for those of you who haven't yet picked it up. We look forward to more conversations like this. Thank you to everyone, and have a great midday.
Thank you all. Take care.